The battleground of gender, whether it's the gender pay gap or whether it's traditional gender roles, this seems to be where science denialism lives on the left. In the more, like what I always grew up thinking about the left was always more open-minded. They were supposed to be the more educated, and they were supposed to be the more compassionate people. So something happened, and I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the line, this science denialism and this, for whatever reason, this idea that if it shows any differences, if there's any statistics or any data that shows differences between the men and the women, that this is somehow an example of sexism or patriarchal tyranny, or right. There's a reason for this that's negative.
So I think the reason is actually quite simple. The right-wing folks who deny science, it's typically for religious ideological reasons.
Or for industry.
Right. So there is some pet ideology that is threatening me, and therefore I'm going to deny science.
Right.
This exact same thing is happening with the left. They also have been parasitized by a quasi-religion. It's called progressivism, okay? And I say progressivism in quotes, right? Equality of outcomes and all the rest of the garbage, right? And therefore, to the extent that evolutionary theory in general, but evolutionary psychology in particular, is a threat to my quasi-religion, then I will reject it. This is why evolution deniers tend to be on the right and evolution psychology deniers tend to be on the left. They've both been parasitized by religions. They're just different religions.
Hello everyone, this is Turd Flinging Monkey, and today we're going to return to the political trichotomy. And something I mentioned in passing in a previous video is that communism essentially replaced religion. This spot on the left, on this one point of the triangle, used to be occupied by religion, by the clergy. Back in that day, you had the merchant class taking the role of the individualist capitalist, you had the monarch in the role of the absolutist, and you had the clergy in the role of communism. In the last few centuries, communism has replaced the clergy and become the official state religion of not just the United States, but the entire Western world. I'm going to play a clip from a YouTuber named Charlemagne who's analyzing a letter from Mentions Moldbug, so let's just check it out.
Moldbug begins part 9 by describing how the origins of the progressive versus conservative conflict is to be found in the conflict between progressive Christians and fundamentalist Christians in the early 20th century. Moldbug cites Professor Carlton Hayes' book, A Political and Cultural History of Modern Europe, published in 1916 and updated in 1924, which describes how the original progressives were a Protestant sect in opposition to fundamentalist Christians. I will read his embedded quotation to set the context. Hayes says, quote, "Among Protestant Christian sects, there were several significant movements toward cooperation and even toward formal union. Many barriers between them were broken down, at least in part, by the Young Men's Christian Association, which had been founded in the 19th century, but which expanded very rapidly during and after the Great War. The Salvation Army, dating from about the year 1880, was another factor in the same process. It placed emphasis on spiritual earnestness, on evangelical work among the poor, and on charitable endeavors, rather than on sectarian controversies. There were also various, quote, federations of churches, end quote, and in Canada, after the Great War, several Protestant denominations were actually united. Such interdenominational and unifying movements were made easier by the fact that the original theological differences between the various sects were no longer regarded as very important by a large number of church members. Some Protestants, reacting against the decline of dogma and the doubting of the miraculous and the supernatural, turned increasingly toward Christian Science or towards spiritualism or theosophy. In some countries, and especially in the United States, the current vogue of Darwinism and other theories of evolution caused a new outburst of opposition from stalwart groups of Protestants to the claims of, quote, science, end quote, and a stubborn reaffirmation of their fundamental faith in the literal inspiration of the Bible. These, quote, fundamentalists, end quote, as they were called, were fairly numerous in several Protestant denominations, and they contested with their, quote, progressive, end quote, or, quote, modernist, end quote, brethren 1, the control of Protestant churches, particularly the Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Baptist, and Methodist." End quote. Now we get to Moldbug. Quote, "Your present-day progressive or modernist may retain some vestigial belief in God, or not, but she certainly does not think of her faction as a Christian supersect. Meanwhile, her fundamentalist adversaries have largely appropriated the label Christian. Neither side sees the red-blue conflict as that old staple of European history, the Christian sectarian war. To our modern fundamentalists, the term has become so opprobrious that they will respond better, dear open-minded progressive, if you use the word traditionalist. The idea that liberalism is actually mainstream Protestant Christianity is about as off-the-wall as it gets, and it must strike most progressives as equally weird. But here it is in black and white from a legendary Columbia historian. Obviously, someone is off the wall. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's you. Are you feeling paranoid yet, dear reader? Progressivism is quite literally a religion, its foundational mythology enshrined in the words, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," end quote. Americans are not taught to examine the Declaration of Independence critically, but mulling over it for mere moments shows that there is nothing self-evident about this at all. In fact, simple observation shows that the opposite is better evidenced. Yet people believe it, because it is part of the American tradition, as Moldbug reminds us. Quote, "The first step toward a historical perspective on the conflict is to acknowledge that both of these traditions are exactly that, traditions. You did not invent progressivism any more than Billy Joe invented fundamentalism. Thanks to Professor Hayes, we know this absolutely, because we know that both of these things existed 84 years ago, and you are not 84. And what is the difference between a mere tradition and an honest-to-God religion? Theology. A mini-God or a three-God or a one-God tradition is a religion. A no-God tradition is... well, there isn't really a word for it, is there? This is a good clue that someone has been tampering with the tools you use to think. Clearly, there can be religious traditions without a god, ideas with their own theology, sans the personhood of a deity. Moldbug has given us the word our religion to describe such a tradition, a type that Americans know very well. As previously mentioned, one is enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. The self-evidenced equality of men is stated as a truth evident in of itself, beyond the necessity of requiring additional proof. This belief is quite Christian, and the fact that modern progressives maintain it despite their atheism is ironic but not surprising. After all, as we know, progressivism was created by Christians from Christian beliefs. The problem is that if progressivism is indeed a Christian supersect, it is also a criminal conspiracy. Assuming you're an American, dear open-minded progressive, you might have forgotten that it's quite literally illegal for the federal government to, quote, "make an establishment of religion," end quote. While its authors and ratifiers never meant the clause to mean what it means today, we do have a living constitution. The law is what it is now, and over the last half-century our friends in high places have been quite enthusiastic about deploying it against their fundamentalist foes. Perhaps some perspective can be obtained by replacing the words modernist and fundamentalist in Professor Hayes' narrative with Sunni and Shia. The First Amendment does not say, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of Shiism." More to the point, it does not say, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion until that religion manages to sneak God under the carpet, at which point go ahead, dudes." Rather, the obvious spirit of the law is that Congress shall be neutral with respect to the theological disputes of its citizens, such as that described by Professor Hayes. Has it been?
No, maybe you don't believe me. Maybe you think that progressivism isn't directly tied to Protestant Christianity. But in order to further cement my case, I'm going to play another clip from Academy of Ideas and their video about education and control.
The advent of compulsory public schooling in the West is often viewed as a sign of progress, a development which granted all individuals an equal opportunity to become educated, cultivate one's cognitive faculties, and improve one's position in life. But this optimistic view is not shared by all. Rather, many who have studied the history of public education have concluded that its primary role from the beginning was not to uplift and enlighten, but to act as a form of social control. The great American writer H.L. Mencken encapsulated this view. The most erroneous assumption is to the effect that the aim of public education is to fill the young of the species with knowledge and awaken their intelligence. Nothing could be further from the truth. The aim of public education is not to spread enlightenment at all. It is simply to reduce as many individuals as possible to the same safe level, to breed and train a standardized citizenry, to put down dissent and originality. That is its aim in the United States, whatever the pretensions of politicians, and that is its aim everywhere else. The roots of compulsory education reach back to ancient Greece, where Spartan children were taken from their parents and housed in military schools under the ideal of cultivating total obedience to the Spartan state. The more modern form of compulsory public schooling, however, originated in the 16th century. In 1524, Martin Luther, a primary figure in the Protestant Revolution, which amounted to a rejection of the Roman Catholic Church in favor of the Bible as the sole authority of truth, wrote a letter to the German leaders of the time, urging them to institute a mandatory schooling system. Luther's letter reads as follows: I maintain that the civil authorities are under obligation to compel the people to send their children to school. If the government can compel such citizens as are fit for military service to bear spear and rifle, and perform other martial duties in time of war, how much more has it a right to compel the people to send their children to school? Because in this case we are warring with the devil, whose object it is secretly to exhaust our cities and principalities of their strong men. Luther understood that compulsory schooling could be used to indoctrinate young minds into the Lutheran Church, and sought to use state power to achieve this end. As a result of his pleadings, numerous German states created the first modern public schools. In many ways, Martin Luther can be thought of marking the birth of the modern schooling system. Not only was he the first advocate of compulsory schooling, but his conviction that the state should use its power to indoctrinate its citizens into a specific worldview helped stimulate in Germany a climate of increasing subjugation to the state. The great historian Lord Acton wrote of Martin Luther that he impressed on his party that character of political dependence, and that habit of passive obedience to the state. William Torrey Harris, the United States Commissioner of Education in the late 19th century, and steadfast believer that the child was the absolute property of the government, wrote in his book The Philosophy of Education, 99 students out of 100 are automata, careful to walk in prescribed paths, careful to follow the prescribed custom. This is not an accident, but the result of substantial education which, scientifically defined, is the subsumption of the individual. Frederick Taylor Gates, business advisor to John D. Rockefeller, who in 1903 founded the General Education Board, which provided major funding for schools and was a big supporter of state-controlled compulsory schooling, wrote in his 1913 book, The Country School of Tomorrow, "In our dream, the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or of science. We are not to raise up from among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians. Nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply. For the task that we set before ourselves is a very simple, as well as a very beautiful one, to train these people as we find them for a perfectly ideal life just where they are, an idyllic life under the skies and within the horizon, however narrow, where they first open their eyes. To keep the student confined to a narrow horizon, or in the words of Mencken, to use compulsory schooling to breed and train a standardized citizenry, to put down dissent and originality, was the goal of many of the most influential educational reformers."
It's been said many times that progressivism is a religion. Feminism, social justice, these are not simply ideologies, these are religions. They have specific bodies of belief, they deny science, they have all the hallmarks of a religion. If they were simply atheistic scientists who followed the facts, then they wouldn't believe the things they believe. The belief that everyone's equal, that everyone's the same, that everything's a social construct, these are all religious views. These are Protestant religious values. And this has become the state religion of the United States and the entire Western world. They did this by de-emphasizing theology, emphasizing things like helping the poor and social justice. This has become the new de facto religion of the West. The struggle between conservatives and progressives is honestly just an extension of the age-old struggle between fundamentalists and progressives, or Catholics and Protestants. As you can see, even removing God from the equation, removing all supernatural and theological elements from the religion, does not dilute its purpose. The Protestant Christian values of equality are carried out via a non-theological religion that we know today as progressivism. If you truly want to defeat progressivism once and for all, well, not really for all, it's going to come back probably, but you have to replace it with some kind of religion. Religion is simply something most people need. You cannot permanently destroy man's desire to be free, and you cannot permanently destroy man's desire to be equal. Even though these are mutually exclusive, you cannot have one without diminishing the other. Man still desires both, whatever benefits him at the time. And so there will always be struggle. The sad thing is that the progressives have used the separation of church and state in the United States to essentially run the board. They have removed their opponents, the fundamentalist Christians, making them unable to compete, because by citing the separation of church and state, they've been able to impose their atheistic Christianity onto the entirety of Western civilization. They are the state religion. If you want to be a politician in a country like Iran, you need the blessing of the Ayatollah. If you want to be president of the United States, you need the blessing of the media, of academia, of progressivism. And while some of you will immediately start typing how Trump proves that I'm wrong, I want you to remember that Trump was a Democrat. The Overton window has simply shifted so far to the left that the Democrats of yesteryear are now considered the reincarnation of Hitler. The purpose of this video is to explain how progressivism is a religion and how it became the official religion in the United States. That it is now one and indistinguishable from the government. And in the end, whether you live in a theocratic dictatorship or a communist dictatorship, it hardly matters to you. You're just as dead, you're just as enslaved. And this is why the other two sides of the triangle have to oppose the left, which they've been unable to successfully do thus far. It is the nature of the trichotomy to rebalance itself. It can be rebalanced softly, hardly, or extremely violently, but the triangle will be rebalanced one way or the other. This is Turd Flinging Monkey, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.